Hi, I'm James,
And I'm Anthony.
and this is Words and Numbers. So what's interesting this week, Ant?
Well, James, I ran across a couple of interesting things. One of them, President Trump signed an executive order allowing health insurance company purchases across state lines. This is one of the things that prior to the Affordable Care Act, economists pointed to as something that boosts the cost of health insurance, that health insurance companies had effectively set up little fiefdoms within the various states, preventing competition. So we'll see if this has any appreciable effect on the cost of health insurance. Another interesting thing, and this comes out of California, the Council for Education and Research on Toxics has filed a lawsuit to force Starbucks and other sellers of coffee to post warning labels, believe it or not, that coffee may cause cancer. And not to be outdone by the Council for Education and Research on Toxics, California Assemblyman Phil Ting says he will propose a bill to outlaw gasoline-powered cars by 2040. Apparently, spending no time thinking about what that will cost, I ran some back-of-the-envelope calculations. If California outlaws all gasoline-powered engines and goes to electric, it will have to build about 15 new electrical generation plants just to power those cars.
Well, if it's good for certain European countries, then surely it's good for the People's Republic of California. We'll see how that all works out 30 years from now. I'm guessing technology either renders that a pointless thing or an impossible thing.
It's not beyond California to go ahead with it, even if it is pointless and impossible.
Well, perhaps I've got a couple of things that will make us scratch our head a little less anyway. President Maduro down in Venezuela has told his people to prepare for war with the United States. And in all fairness, Trump did say recently that the United States might intervene, that's always the word we like to use, intervene in Venezuela to help the Venezuelan people recover their country, was the exact quote. But this really smells a lot more like a regime on its way out, looking for some kind of common, convenient enemy to rally the people a little bit. And then on the happier side of things, because you know how I love this sort of thing, NASA plans to send a probe to the sun. Insert joke here. But it turns out, and I did not know this, one of the questions they hope to answer with this probe, which is going to orbit the sun at some 4 million miles, one of the questions that they hope to get an answer to is why the sun's atmosphere is hotter than its surface. I had no idea that was the case, but now I do, and isn't that interesting?
And this is the thing that's interesting to me as an economist. Physicists will figure out why the surface of the sun is hotter than the core, what have you. And everyone will nod and say, oh, yes, that's the way it is. But let an economist figure out something and say, well, this is what happens when you impose a minimum wage. And everyone says, that's not the case.
Yeah, I don't know what to say to that. I don't want to listen to economists given our deep and illustrious history any more than anybody else. So we're just going to let that one slide. And on that happy note, we turn our attention to the Fed, which this week released all kinds of data. And it come to find out, Ant, that the federal government is actually quite good at digesting and releasing data. It makes the life of the economist and the social scientist quite a lot easier. And here we have the Fed releasing some income data from 2013 to 2016, and some interesting things emerge, right? First of which is nearly all American families experienced substantial gains in wealth over that period. So I've got a couple of layman's questions for you to get us rolling today, Ant. The first, what is wealth and how is it measured? And then the second, we keep hearing a lot about income inequality and what a problem it is. So what's going on here with wealth? Are wealth and income the same? Are they different? What do they measure? And so forth. So why don't you get us started with what wealth actually is and how it's measured?
That's interesting. People often confuse those. They'll use them synonymously, wealth and income. They're very different things. Income, of course, is what you earn over the course of a year. Wealth is your assets minus your liabilities. So when you're talking about households, typically a household's biggest asset is the home, the house that you live in, assuming you own the house. Then following that, if you have a 401k or an IRA, something built up like that. And then, it goes down to your car, money in the bank, that sort of thing. So that all goes on the asset side. And then subtract from that on the liability side what kind of debt you have. So if you owe a mortgage, that's a minus. You have credit card debt, that's a minus, right? You have car payments, that's a minus. So all the pluses minus all the minuses gives you wealth. So you could think of it, roughly speaking, as the household savings, right?
All right, so if wealth has increased by and large for just about everyone over the past 3 or 4 years, what's the takeaway? What's the big picture that we get from the Fed data that was released this week?
Well, I think there are a couple of things, and one is on the surface. We've got an increase in inequality, wealth inequality, an increase in income inequality. And when I say increase, right, this is not a marked increase. This is just part of a background trend that's been going on for the past probably 20 or more years. And so you get this increase in inequality, and people immediately jump to a wrong conclusion here. They hear rising inequality, and what they picture mostly is some people getting rich and other people getting poor, and that's rising inequality. And while that is consistent with the idea of inequality, it's not necessarily the case, right? You can have rising inequality if everybody gets richer, but some people get richer faster, right? That will also give you inequality. And it's that latter case that we tend to have in this country. Over time, on average, everybody poor through rich gets richer, but the people who are at the top tend to rise faster.
And that seems to be the case with the data, at least from the last 4 years or so that were just recently released. It does seem to be the case that, on balance, almost everybody's doing better to some degree or another. Am I reading the data correctly?
Yeah, that's right. Everybody is pretty much doing better. Again, there are some people who are doing worse, but on average, all the income groups tend to do better. Now, having said all of that, people will get still bent out of shape, saying, well, all right, the poor are getting richer, but it's not right that the rich are getting richer faster. And one of the problems with that is that we have this idea that the rich is a static group, and it isn't. People move back and forth. There was a recent study by the University of Michigan, and they looked at people, a whole large group of people over 10 years, and they tracked these people. What are their incomes as these years go by? And what they found was that of people in the top 1%, over the course of 10 years, 58% of them fell out of the top 1%. And of the people in the bottom 20%, the poorest section, 56% of those rose up to the middle class or higher. So there's a tremendous amount of churn. It's false to talk about the rich as if it was this static group of people.
Yeah, but making the opposite point for just a minute, it seems to be the case that even our presentation, when we talk about these things in public, is a little confused, right? Because the differentiation between income inequality on the one hand and wealth inequality on the other doesn't seem to be drawn sharply enough. Right? We don't talk enough about the differences one to the next. And while I think it's clearly the case that in terms of income, we get all this churn, do we really get that much churn in terms of wealth?
Yeah, there's less churn in terms of wealth, which is what you would expect, right? Wealth is a harder number to move than income is. But one of the things to keep in mind about wealth, again, people tend to have a misconception. When you talk about a large amount of wealth, people picture, what's Donald Duck's uncle, Scrooge, right? Who swims in his piles of coins. Yeah, and that's what people picture, somebody sitting on a mound of money. And I think that's not the right way to look at people with wealth. Someone with wealth is someone who has spent a lot of years producing value for others and not asking for much in exchange, and therefore building up this cash. And that's what a pile of cash is. It's an amount of goods and services that society still owes this person for what the person has done for society in the past. Right? We think about people who are frugal, and we think, well, being frugal is good. Well, guess what? When you're frugal, you build up wealth. That's what frugality brings.
Well, it could mean those things, and it often does mean exactly those things, but almost as often, I would hazard to guess, it means somebody inherited tremendous wealth.
Yeah, and that's interesting because actually that's a small minority of the cases, people who inherit their wealth. And those who do inherit their wealth tend to squander it. It's so that there was a study done not too long ago showing that in the majority of cases of children who receive a large inheritance within one, sometimes two generations at most, that wealth is squandered, and by a third generation it's gone.
In the nothing new under the sun category, Machiavelli in the 15th century made exactly that observation. So this is one of those things that, there may be no simple answer that will satisfy everyone, but the observation that getting a good deal of wealth as a matter of birth is no guarantee that you'll hold it over time. And maybe that's as close to actual egalitarianism that we're going to get on this, but we'll get back to that in a minute or two. In the meantime, I wanted to ask another fundamental nuts and bolts kind of question. Is the data that the Fed released indicative that we're just now essentially fully out of the Great Recession from 2008? Is that really what we're seeing here?
Well, I think we came out of the recession several months or more ago, officially speaking, right? And when I say officially speaking, the Fed has particular benchmarks, so your GDP per capita has to grow, this sort of thing. So according to those official measures, we came out of the recession some time ago.
All right, so what we're left with then is an emergent story that seems, I think, to have two discrete sections, right? Two separate stories are emerging. One of those stories is an absolute story, and one of those stories is a relative story. So we're going to have to think about poverty both in absolute terms and in relative terms, right? Because we tend to perceive ourselves relative to other people in our geographic area, for better or for worse. So Americans compare themselves to other Americans. The poor in America don't really want to consider themselves against the poor, say, of sub-Saharan Africa. They want to consider themselves against the middle class in America.
Yeah, in one sense, that's understandable because that they're not living amongst the poor in sub-Saharan Africa. But in another sense, really, compared to the poor in sub-Saharan Africa, what we call the poor in the United States is an upper middle class style of life.
Right. So in absolute terms, we're probably doing pretty well here, right? Most people aren't going to have a lot of cause to complain in absolute terms in the United States of America, or indeed even in the West. In relative terms, though, maybe there is some cause for concern here. And one of the things that popped out at me when I took a look at the data is that the Fed reports that in 2016, the top 1% of households held 24% of American wealth, which is the highest on record. And now we are most certainly dealing with wealth and not income. And just to put this in perspective, right, if this is the highest on record, well, what does that mean? In 1989, that number was 17%. So we are, in fact, seeing wealth concentrated into fewer hands over time.
Well, you're seeing it concentrated into fewer hands, but it's not the same hands. There's tremendous mobility. So the people that are in the 1% today are not the people who are in the 1%. The last time we looked at these numbers, and the people who are going to be in the 1% 10 years from now are going to be different from who's there now. So there's this tremendous amount of mobility as people move from the poor to the middle class to the rich, and they move from the rich to the middle class to the poor. And if you recognize that there's tremendous mobility, all of a sudden, inequality actually starts to look like it might be a good thing. Because if we're all moving forward, albeit the rich moving forward faster than the poor, and there's tremendous mobility such that this decade I might be the poor, but next decade I might be amongst the rich, that rising inequality is increasing my possibilities for the future. So with greater inequality, when I do move up to be the middle class or the rich, I'm moving up to a point that is going to be higher than it would have been had we had less inequality.
Yeah, and all of that might be exactly correct, and I'm willing to stipulate that it is. Um, However, we're still left with a bit of a problem here. And the problem, I think, probably gets us beyond simple economics and gets into things like political economy, even into political philosophy as we start to think about these things. But as a greater percentage of the wealth is concentrated in fewer hands over time, what ends up happening is a thinner and thinner slice of the population ends up with an increasing share in political power over time, right? And this is potentially disastrous. Now, I throw all of this out there as a possibility. I think it's probably a likely possibility, but as a possibility nonetheless. But the weird thing is, at least in my mind, is the very people who complain about this most vociferously, and we hear people complaining about this sort of thing all the time, their solution is inevitably and invariably to empower the government even more than it's already empowered, which, if they're correct, would concentrate that power in fewer and fewer hands over time, right? Thus exacerbating the problem, making it far worse than it might have been if we had taken a different approach on these matters. And, people hear you and I speak on the potential evil of an all-powerful government quite a lot. We talk about it all the time. But here goes an avenue that is almost completely unexplored by people who are in favor of very powerful government. Right? Well, what happens when that powerful government is captured by a class of people who control all of the wealth? And now you've got a prescription for disaster. And I'm wondering how they keep missing this massive disconnect in the middle of their thought.
Yeah, this goes back to a point that I've talked about frequently, which is this illusion that government's a magic wand. So more government means more magical things are going to happen, when in fact all that happens is the more government you have, the more profitable it is for the wealthy to co-opt the government to their ends. The real problem that you've identified with wealth concentration isn't the wealth. It's the fact that it can co-opt government. Government's the problem.
Right, and we're left with an unlikely situation where people are correctly diagnosing a problem and then suggesting more of the problem to solve the problem, which maybe it's a counterintuitive analysis that we're going to have to undertake, but if we're to take seriously this possibility that government is controlled by the wealthy, that, for lack of a better term, the government is bought and paid for by the wealthy, which seems to be the underlying concern that a lot of people have in this country. And I don't think it's altogether unreasonable that they have it. But the solution that they offer will not make it any better. Indeed, it will only make it worse.
Yes. Yeah, it just augments the core problem. Take for example, Warren Buffett has repeatedly advocated for a greater estate tax. Right now, Warren Buffett, whatever he is, the second, third most wealthy man in the country, if not the world, advocating for a higher estate tax. That's kind of weird if you think about it, right? Because he's the kind of guy who he would have a bunch of wealth that he would leave to his heirs, and his heirs would then be subject to this estate tax for which he advocates. Now, here's an interesting thing. I don't suggest it's his only motivation, but I do suggest it plays a part. And that is that his company, Berkshire Hathaway, is in the business of selling insurance. Now, why is that interesting? Because life insurance is one of the tools that people use to get around the estate tax. So here we have someone who's in the wealthy class, co-opting the government, advocating for a particular policy that, at least to some extent, actually benefits him.
Yeah, no, and look, I don't think we're going to solve the world's problems in this respect in a 25-minute podcast, but it does us well to point out the logical inconsistency, even as we say that the diagnosis might well be correct, right? So if smart people of goodwill are going to work forward on this problem, trying to figure out how we can best get around it, right? Because really that's the best we ever do anyway, is getting around problems. Then it bears some serious discussion about the nature of the solution relative to the problem. And this is something that people are just going to have to think about. And maybe that's a little pessimistic as we wander out of this, but be that as it may, it does seem that the data that led us to this sprawling conversation also lead us to a conclusion that it might be the case, finally, that the jobs picture is looking considerably better, right? That seems to be a very easy extrapolation from this data.
Yeah, the job situation is definitely looking better. Income is looking better. Inequality is getting worse, but that's again a relative thing. In absolute terms, income is looking better pretty much across the board.
All right, so on that happy note, I'll throw it back to you for a final word here, Ant.
Well, I would suggest keep in mind that wealth and income don't fall out of the sky. We produce these things. So it's not right to say, for example, 1% of Americans hold 24% of the wealth. The correct statement is 1% of Americans created 24% of the wealth. And if you phrase it correctly, that statement now turns our attention to where it should be. Rather than focusing on taking wealth that the rich created and redistributing to the poor, we should instead be focusing on helping the poor create wealth also. And the recipe there is education, job training, work experience, and importantly, a regulatory and tax environment that doesn't discourage entrepreneurs from taking risks.
And that's about all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next Wednesday at about noon Eastern time for another episode. Until then, have a look at all the great content at fee.org and at Fee Online on social media. And we'll probably write something between now and then, too. So, Ant, I'll see you next week. Have a good one.
Have a good week, James.